All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. So I'm excited, to say the least. This is number two or number three in the candidate series. My everything is kind of thrown off because there's been a lot happening. The headlines right now, obviously, there's a lot going on, right? There's a ton going on. But today I am joined by Chris, who's running in California District 3 against I'm gonna let you explain that, Chris. Because you explained it a lot better than what I wanted to say. I'll let you go ahead and explain, or tell our audience like who you are and why you're running. Let's walk through a little bit about like past organizing, like your past, just a lot of your history and why you're running now.
Sure. So I am Chris Bennett. I'm running in the third district of California following Prop 50, which now is a pretty massive district. It has urban, suburban, and rural areas all the way from like Southeast Sacramento, north through Rancho Cordova, Folsom, Auburn, all the way to Nevada County, all the way east to like Truckee, South Lake Tahoe on the border of Nevada. So it's a very big district. I am a people first, corporate free progressive, and I'm also a disabled Army veteran. I came from a long line of military veterans, and I'm the oldest brother of 11 kids with nine younger siblings and an older stepsister who I don't like to count because I like to be the oldest. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. But when I was in sixth grade and getting ready for school one morning, my uncle, my tío Ramirito, called from Puerto Rico and told me to turn on the news. And when I watched the second plane hit the World Trade Center, I decided that I would instead follow in my parents' footsteps. So I only applied to one school, and that was the United States Military Academy at West Point. I graduated in 2013 with a degree in computer science and commissioned as an artillery officer. And then I served for 2 years overseas in South Korea. And while I was there, from 2014 to 2016, I like to say that I got radicalized by Bernie Sanders when he ran for president the first time. He made me question a lot of the things about our system and our society. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why did 9/11 happen? Why is it that we have, people who are rich enough to buy private islands and then people who are so poor that they're homeless despite the fact that they work full-time jobs?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan? I was raised in a very conservative, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh household, but I was also taught to think critically and to love my neighbor. So the vision of the future that he presented was infinitely more compelling to me, and I've been a progressive ever since. I became a cyber warfare officer after 2016, and then got out of the Army as a captain in 2018 when I moved to California and worked in healthcare IT. I worked as a senior manager for IT business operations, data analytics, infrastructure, cybersecurity, unified telecommunications. And while I was working full time at Kaiser and then Sutter, I also earned my MBA from UC Berkeley in 2022. Now, after that, became a technology strategy management consultant, which sort of led up to, the whole things that had started happening with Israel, right? Um, I didn't really know anything about Israel when October 7th happened, but I was an artillery officer. And I was also a West Point graduate. And they teach us about international and humanitarian law and the laws of just warfare and what constitutes a war crime. So when I saw them carpet bombing apartment buildings, I was like, those are war crimes. I would go to prison at Fort Leavenworth if I had done those things. So I started to learn the history of it. And then after this second Trump election, I was sitting in my office and I was listening to this content creator called Innuendo Studios, who made this really influential series called The Alt-Right Playbook, which was sort of about the rise of MAGA fascism. And he was talking about how fascism is not something that happens all at once. It's more like a death of a thousand cuts. And if you don't take stock of exactly where you are when things start happening, you won't even know what you become desensitized to before it's far too late. So we had everyone pull out a piece of paper and write down right now in this moment, what is your line? That when that line gets crossed, you'll actually do something about it. So for me, I wrote down people getting black bagged or kidnapped off the street. And that started happening last April, 2025, when masked ICE agents started kidnapping immigrant students who organized protests against Israel's genocide in Gaza. And, I I'm a one-track mind kind of person. I followed through. So I quit my job to run for Congress because Congress is a decisive point of our democracy with the power to impeach, the power of the purse, and the power to fix our broken system. So it actually works for everyday people like you and me. Leading up to now, though, it's really just been about like going out, talking to people, and understanding the kinds of problems that people are experiencing, and the fact that so many young people have no hope for the future. Our campaign is different. It's not we just dump a bunch of ads onto TV and expect you to show up and be a good Democrat or good Republican, just vote every 2 years and then, go back to ignoring politics. For us, it's about rebuilding real people power. We like to say that we are built on hope and powered by everyday people. And when I say hope, I don't mean like a poster of Barack Obama. I mean hope as in the feeling that what is wanted can be had if we put in the work to make that hope a reality. So that sort of brings us to this point where we are running against a corporate APAC nothing politician named Ami Bera, who has taken more than $1 million from the Israel lobby. He continues to send them money and weapons to starve and bomb children to death, despite the fact that he's a pediatrician. He opposes single payer healthcare. He says universal health coverage because he takes money from big pharma and private health insurance companies on top of Fox News, Home Depot, Lockheed Martin, and even SpaceX. So for us, we're trying to both bring real representation to the people of this third district, but also remove one of these corporate do nothing politicians who are continuing to sell out the American people.
Exactly. And one of the pledges that you took was money out of politics, which is a commitment to democracy, transparency, and public service. So, because as like your website states, bennettforca.com, as a candidate for public office, I recognize that our democracy thrives only when elected officials answer to the people, not to corporate donors, special interests, or secretive political financiers. For too long, billionaires and special interests have used campaign cash to drown out the voices of everyday Americans. That ends with us, which is absolutely the most truest statement in American, politics, right? And this is more than just a pledge, right? This is literally a part of your direct platform because you talk specifically on your platform and you have a lot of incredible endorsements too, a lot of union, which I'm glad to see that. My grandfather was a part of a union here in Kansas City. He worked, for many years and he was also a Air Force veteran. So I also come from a very long line of a military background, and I learned a lot about his service. I didn't learn as much as I wanted to because I was younger. Um, he passed away in 2020, but never really had a chance to actually sit down and actually talk to him about, a lot about military wise. But I did learn a lot, and I did a lot of research on the military industrial complex and like the for-profit, prison systems. And I've done a lot of research around criminal justice. I was on probation for 5.5 years for something that I did not do whenever I was 13 years old. I was forced into that juvenile justice system, on probation for 5 years. Do you know how hard it is being a smart ass teenager, being on probation, that any little false move, I could be thrown in juvie and juvenile detention center without even batting an eye? And I faced my own peers. The judge or, like the youth court was a high school student that literally determined my future. Literally determined my future. I'm not saying I'm against that. However, it's functioning exactly. I was introduced to these corrupt systems working exactly how they were designed to harm innocent people. And thinking about especially harming innocent people, housing. So affordable housing, because we know that universal housing. What I do love the fact that you talk about create public financing for low and middle income housing. So this essentially would expand more of the public housing option because housing vouchers only go so far and there's still criteria, still things, but we need to expand. So I would love for you to talk more about what affordable housing looks like and how this would look to, the low and middle income populations. Because obviously this is very critical, especially whenever they continue to pass legislation to criminalize being an unhoused person, doing these camp or, going through and sweeping these camps. These people have no other option because the rent is too damn high. The cost of living continues to increase and the wages continue to decrease. They haven't lifted the federal minimum wage since I believe it's like 2005.
Yep.
Um,
Before
they
I graduated, it was before I graduated from high school in 2008.
and it's very obvious that the current systems are not working. So let's talk about affordable housing. Let's kind of dive in and talk about this. So, what would a federally backed civil service home loan, like a VA loan, to allow teachers, social workers, caregivers, etc., to benefit? What would be the steps into getting to that specific point that you obviously would like to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, so first I will say that the step to get to any point of our platform is we need to build
Yes.
and take political power.
Yes.
And that's something that the Republicans have learned how to do. What their whole platform is built on is we're not going to make your life better, but we'll tell you who is to blame, even though it's not who is actually to blame, and then we'll punish those people for you. That is really the promise of the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, their promise is we're going to ignore what you say, and we're going to give you every once in a while, we'll throw you a bone on some social issue, but we're still going to be dropping bombs on people. We're still going to be prioritizing the desires of giant corporations and billionaires and health insurance companies. So, one of the big underpinnings of everything in our society is the belief that the ruling class has that in order for them to maintain their power and the status quo, there needs to be a permanent underclass. And that permanent underclass is maintained through oppressive systems, things like criminalizing minority areas, people who are low income, people who have disabilities, mental illnesses, Black and brown people, immigrants, trans people, for example. These are the people who are always being attacked and marginalized. And whenever the ruling class destroys the economy, they blame those people. And then what the ruling class loves to do is to pass policies that hurt people, they kill people. And when everything is terrible, they then start to blame the people who are actually being hurt the most. So that's the first and foremost thing. Now, for me, one thing that I will point out is that we used to have affordable housing. We used to have basically these like high density units that were just a small room with a bed in it that anyone could get for a very cheap price. And those got closed down because of heavy lobbying from like the real estate industry, for example. So they closed those down. And then one of the big things that we did was we said, okay, the American dream is to have your own house with a white picket fence and a car and a dog and a wife and two kids, right? For men. And one of the reasons why they created that particular dream in that way was that they wanted to align everyday people with the interests of the ruling class. It was a way to basically stop high density urban areas from forming and instead maintain like this gigantic suburban sprawl that we see across the country. So one thing that we need to do is we need to actually like build higher density and redevelop in our areas that traditionally speaking have just been focused on having like 10 single family like giant mansions, and then you have homeless people who can't afford to live. There's actually something called the Affordable Rent Act in California by a group called ACE. And one of the things that they have on their website is this really stark metric where they say that every single $100 increase in the median rent leads to a 9% increase in homelessness. So every time our landlords collectively jack up the rent by $100 across the board, that means 1 in 10 people are going homeless as a result. So that's the problem that we're facing right now. Now, in terms of affordable housing, like public housing specifically, there's a bunch of different things that we need to do. Now, when I say public housing, I mean that the federal government should actually be building public housing ourselves because the entire point of a government is to do the things that private markets and individuals are unwilling or unable to do. Now, I have a business school degree, and I can tell you that real estate developers have learned that it is far more profitable to have a luxury apartment complex that's half full than to have a lower middle income apartment complex that's completely full. And that's why they refuse to actually build lower middle income units. So when the private market refuses to do anything to meet those needs, that's the whole point why we even have a government in the first place. So the government should be building housing directly. And I think that should be part of something like a Green New Deal or a civil service corps or a federal jobs guarantee. Like people need jobs because right now we can't afford to live and everything that we have is tied to employment. But on top of that, we also need to actually be putting public financing into building low and middle income housing because the reason why real estate developers don't do it is because there's just not enough money in it, right? So we attack it from multiple angles. We say we're going to put downward pressure on the housing market to make it cheaper by building them ourselves. And we're also going to make it easier for the private market to get access to funding. That means that it's more profitable for them to do it. That way we attack it from both angles, which means we're less likely to get a ton of pushback. I mean, we're going to get a ton of pushback anyway, but it's sort of like I believe in doing things where you incentivize and disincentivize because that's the way that you can actually be more successful. Now, when it comes to a civil service loan, we already have a model for that. The veterans came together and fought for the VA loan, which is a federally backed, no down payment home loan, which means anyone who qualifies for their service, typically speaking, you serve at least 3 months in, you get access to a home loan through the Veterans Administration where you don't have to put a down payment. Oh,
Like it.
oh
I'm
yeah.
I'm gonna edit this part out. Continue talking, but my dog is freaking out on the fly.
Oh, no worries.
I started laughing, so I took myself off really quick. I'll edit this part out, don't worry, but she freaks out on the littlest things. But
No
I'll
worries.
be I'll be back here in just a second.
Okay. I'm gonna get some water actually. I'll be right back.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry.
No worries.
She was in a sound sleep and a fly landed on her and she like freaked the fuck out.
All good.
I had to take myself off really quick because I could not stop laughing.
No worries.
Oh god, my chest hurts from laughing too hard. But um,
Yeah, so I'll continue.
yes,
So basically, I think that we need a civil service home loan that's like the VA loan. And when I say civil service, I mean anything that's beneficial to society. That could be being a teacher, being a social worker, being a firefighter. Anything that's actually making the lives of other people better should like those types of people should have access to the same kind of benefits that veterans get because we take care of veterans in this country, but in a lot of cases, the things that they're sending us overseas to do are not pro-social. They're bad. Like the reason why so many veterans end up with PTSD, a lot of recent studies and research that are coming out are saying that it's because of things called moral injuries. Now, a moral injury is basically like you go somewhere and you're doing bad stuff, you know it's bad, and you feel bad about it. And that is extremely traumatic. So, if we can give veterans who, in a lot of cases, are being abused in order to prop up private business interests, access to social mobility and a home loan, then why the hell aren't we doing that for people that are actually helping Americans right now? So I believe that we need a civil service home loan so that everyday people who are actually helping others can actually get the same kind of access to housing. Um, One of my favorite books is called Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. And one of the things that he talks about is how basically the more directly the work that you do helps other human beings, the less you're going to get paid for it. And the less you help other human beings, the more you're going to get paid for it. And I just believe that we as a society need to flip that on its head, right? Like teachers should be some of the highest paid people because if we're not investing in young people and education, then we're not investing in anything. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about like public housing, affordable housing. I don't mean like let's just buy off real estate companies and just let them do whatever they want because in a lot of cases they cause a lot of problems with the things that they prioritize because they're always focused on profit motives. And if we can't get them to do it of their own free will and volition, then we have to pressure them, both with good things and with bad things that'll actually force them to play ball.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that it's a very crucial aspect to talk about is playing ball with them. And because it's like, there's a lot of things to negotiate on, right? There's a lot of things that you can meet in the middle on. But obviously, whenever it comes down to the basic human rights, that's something that Democrats and Republicans both get wrong because they meet in the middle and it ends
Yeah.
up, benefiting that top 1%. Meanwhile, it trickles down to those of us who live paycheck to paycheck, who struggle. There's times where it's like, do I pay my phone bill or do I put gas in my car so I can go back and forth to work?
100%.
Do I pay my rent or do I need to put food on the table? Because, they cut food stamp access for millions of people across the country.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
obviously,
we and Israel are the only two countries that voted to say that food is not a human right.
which is insane. And it's literally insane to me. And it's
I
like,
agree.
we jump whenever Israel says, let's do this, right? Look what's happening overseas, right? Look what's going on. Look what's happening.
Yep.
Arming and funding a genocide is not something that I want my mom's healthcare to go to.
Right.
My mom is going through stage 3 cervical cancer. That's not something that I want to see that funding go to bombing innocent children. That's not something that I want to see. Whenever my mom is literally my mother, right? I mean, shouldn't she have access to everything as a disabled woman? Shouldn't she have the expanded options? You would think, right? It's 2026, and we're still here fighting for. We shouldn't even be having this conversation, Chris. We
I
shouldn't.
agree.
We shouldn't even be having this conversation because it's 2026, and these are the same exact things that we've been fighting for decades and decades and decades. Because it goes way beyond just
Centuries
now.
even. Yeah.
So I get off on my tangent, but let's jump in and talk about reproductive rights. So we oftentimes hear, protect the children, right? But how are we necessarily protecting children whenever they're dying in American schools? Today is April 16th and is the anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting. So thinking about that, what does it actually mean to protect children? So on your platform, you state protect children and reproductive freedoms. I support universal child care. Ding ding. Common sense, because it also expands to where parents are able to go to work. A lot of the times, parents leave their jobs because they can't afford to take care of their children. Like it's so incredibly expensive. Um, Access to fertility treatments like IVF, expanded funding into research affecting women's bodies like PCOS, absolutely, and endometriosis, and a constitutional right to reproductive care. Absolutely. Like let's expand more on this. So let's talk about expanding funding into research affecting women's bodies like PCOS and endometriosis. I would also add to this about the Black maternal health. There was a former cheerleader here in Kansas City that was going through childbirth, ended up becoming septic, and she ended up passing away. She was a former Kansas City Chiefs cheerleader, and she was right here in the state of Kansas. And unfortunately, she passed away. Now, her husband has turned his pain into advocating for Black maternal health because Black women have the highest mortality rate in out of any group. So let's talk about Black maternal health. Let's talk about PCOS, endometriosis, and those things that are impacting the women population because this is something that has been attacked for many, many, many years. And I love that you added a part about Sister Song on here, which I follow religiously. Um, Defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Because if we don't have a safe and sustainable community, are we really protecting children? Or is it more just to protect the egos of those in power? To say, oh, look, we're doing this, when in reality, you're actually doing the opposite of what you say you are. So let's jump in and talk about, IVF access, fertility treatments, and universal childcare.
Absolutely. So it's a big topic, obviously, but it's all directly linked to all of the terrible things that we're seeing happening across the board, right? When it comes down to our basic human rights, if one group's rights are being attacked, that means every other group's rights are also under attack. So, the relentless attacks on trans people, for example, who make up a very tiny fraction of the population and generally speaking harm no one, like they're being attacked constantly. Like there's hundreds of bills being introduced across the board and in all these other states and these state legislatures. And the end result is one that trans people feel like they basically don't, no one wants them to exist. But it also means that women's rights are being attacked because women who don't fit the mold of what someone decides is what a woman looks like are getting attacked and trying to have people like question, their biology, for example. So that's one part of it. But the bigger part is that, people just they can't even afford to have kids right now. One of the big reasons why the US needs immigration is because we're facing a population demographic crisis where, we're going to be like many other extremely developed countries where, you have an inverted population pyramid, right? You have tons of people in the older generations who need support from the younger generations. There's just not enough younger people being born. So that's part of it. A big problem that we have across the board in our healthcare industry is that, all of the research that we did to figure out, how our bodies are affected by different things and the treatments that work is we did a bunch of studies on 20-year-old white men in college, and then we just extrapolated that research and just said, okay, this applies to everyone, right? And that just doesn't make any sense because a 20-year-old white man's body is different from, like, let's say, a 34-year-old Black woman who's pregnant, for example. Another thing that we know is that the medical establishment has, in a lot of cases, perpetuated the systemic harms that have come about from things like eugenics and slavery. So there's a reason why, a lot of doctors to this day believe that Black and brown people have higher pain thresholds than white people. It's nonsensical. It's not based on any sort of reality, but a lot of Black women end up dying because the doctors just don't listen to them. So one of the things that we need to do is rectify those problems. That means trying to expand the healthcare workforce and trying to make sure that the doctors that are getting trained look more like the communities that they're supposed to serve. It means making sure that we're actually taking care of children after they're born. Like all the people who call themselves pro-life are really more like pro-birth. And the whole pro-birth movement is very much about maintaining that permanent underclass. Because when you force someone to have a child that they can't afford, that they don't want, it is much more difficult for them to raise that child in a loving household where they have all of their basic needs being met and can grow up and be like a quote unquote productive member of society. So all of these problems are interlinked together, and it really just always goes back down to that idea that some people are inferior and need to be at the bottom so other people can benefit at the top. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that we talked about on there, but I think that sort of covers the broad strokes. If we're not taking care of the most vulnerable populations in our society, then that is an indictment of our entire society. Because, like I said before, if you are selling out the rights of one group, you're basically agreeing to have your own rights being sold. And I think we just need to bring back this concept of just being nice to people because we have lost that. You mentioned it before. It feels like everything on my platform is just like straight up common sense if you have moral clarity and give a shit about other human beings. So, like, the bar is in literal hell, and I think we need to raise the bar. If you're running on the exact same platform issues every single time you get elected for 40 straight years and you don't ever check anything off of your list, then you're not doing anything. So one of the things I believe is like we're gonna cross things off this list and then we're gonna keep adding to it because our representatives should not be maintaining the status quo. They should be fighting for progress.
Which again is 2026. It's common sense. We shouldn't even
Yes.
be having these exact same conversations. It should already be done and moving forward. In a way, the United States is developed. However, there's so much more to do because the generational trauma continues to exist.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about, or, kind of like talking about reproductive rights. We're coming up on the 1 year anniversary of Adriana Smith, the woman that was declared medically brain dead in Georgia, but she was required to stay on life support despite, like reproductive organizations, despite the family's objection. She had a medical emergency in February of 2025. She was declared medically brain dead, but continuing fetal cardiac activity was detected. This case kind of set like the Black mortality rate conversation. Um, on June 13th of last year, I believe it was last year or 2024, one of the two. I believe it was last year. Um, it sparked a lot of that discussion regarding consent and end of life care. Obviously, in Georgia, they have an extreme abortion ban in the state. And on June 13th, her child, which his name is Chance, was born prematurely via emergency cesarean delivery. She was taken off life support 4 days later on June 17th. But she was declared brain dead in February of 2025 and was taken off life support in June 17th. So that way they could deliver, or I wouldn't even say deliver her child, but forcibly remove her child out of her body. Um, this this sparks a lot of conversations. And we know how the mainstream media is. This story has left the headlines because again, nobody gives a damn. And mainstream media and corporate media is complicit. If you look at it and you look at a lot of the stations, there was a video that went viral like many, many years ago
This
that
is
had,
extremely dangerous for our democracy. Yeah.
and it has all of these, news stations repeating the exact same, like everything. And it literally blows your mind if you sit here and think about it. And it's insane. It is literally insane. And I
Yeah,
say
I
that
mean,
very lightly, but
they collude because they're literally owned by the billionaires now. Like every single mainstream media company is owned by a billionaire.
and look at CBS right now. Barry Weiss, like literally the day that the CCOT story, and we'll jump in and talk about DHS here in just a second. That's going to be my next topic that I want to discuss with you. It is like a perfect segue right into that because CCOT, is literally this maximum prison like torture over in El Salvador, right? And Barry Weiss blocked that segment literally hours before it was supposed to air on CBS airwaves. And then Canada decided to air it, so we all got to see it, right? And it detailed a lot of what these immigrants were facing whenever they're taken off of our streets and sent into this. They experienced like sexual abuse. They experienced extreme, attempted castrations. Like it was deeply alarming, right? So thinking about, DHS and thinking about how DHS controls ICE, controls, airport security, controls FEMA, controls Border Patrol, controls literally everything like that. I think it's wild that FEMA is even under DHS. First of all, that's insane to me. It should be its own entity. Because I know one of the strategies that they were trying to do in Congress was to separate. It's like we're going to fund FEMA, we're going to fund, TSA, we're going to fund other aspects, but we're going to leave ICE out of it. But they can't agree on that. So restructure, abolish, or keep DHS.
I
What are
mean,
your
abolish, period. DHS has only existed since like 2002, 2003. It was born from post 9/11 Islamophobia primarily, and it was a way to expand the security state and the surveillance state. It's basically constantly violating our rights to privacy, our freedom of speech, our freedom of movement. So DHS absolutely needs to be changed because what it did was it took all of these domestic things that are really normal for every single country, and then it decided that it was going to do counterterrorism operations against American citizens. It's like one of the big problems that we see with a lot of law enforcement, for example, where they're being trained as if they are going up in a military operation against civilians. And I'm sure you've heard the saying, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you're being trained to look at people as potential terrorists, as opposed to members of the public who you're supposed to serve, that is just fundamentally undermines the entire goal of civil service. So things like Border Patrol and ICE, are routinely being used to violate people's fundamental basic human rights, as well as the Constitution. And, every single member of Congress, every member of the executive branch, we all swear the same oath, same thing with members of the military, to protect the Constitution and uphold it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So if your agency is constantly violating the Constitution, your agency should not exist, period. And I feel very strongly about this because FEMA was supposed to be making up for all of these emergencies that people that we're facing, like from an environmental perspective, but people's like fire departments, especially in these rural areas, which are the most at risk of wildfires, thanks to human-caused climate change, are getting their grants denied because the federal government has decided that the people who need funds the most don't get it because they want to give it to the Epstein class. So now, literally, I was just speaking to members of one of the fire departments in the district yesterday, and they're telling me how they had to basically have a spaghetti dinner fundraiser every single week in order to be able to afford to pay for protective equipment for their firefighters and emergency responders. Like, that is not something that you should be forcing onto a rural community who is already having to deal with the threat of wildfire because that's like the biggest threat that they're facing right now. I also think that, Border Patrol is just completely out of control. A lot of people don't realize this, and there's a reason why I put it onto the website because I think political education is important. But our immigration system used to be open. America was the land of opportunity where anyone could come to make a better life for themselves. But after the railroads had been built on behalf of the robber barons, primarily by Chinese immigrants, there was this huge wave of anti-Chinese racism, and they created the Chinese Exclusion Act to specifically ban Chinese people from getting into the country. And that is the genesis of our current immigration system. It was used in the 1940s and 50s to attack Mexicans. It is being used right now to attack Black and Brown people. And I think we need to just pass an actual humane immigration system that makes it easier for immigrants to come and work here and to have pathways to citizenship. Because what we're doing right now is we are maintaining institutions of slavery and violence against people who don't deserve it. One of the things a lot of people don't understand is that after the Civil War, we outlawed slavery, but we left an exception for people who have been convicted of a crime, which is the reason why Black and Brown people are disproportionately more likely to be arrested and convicted of a crime. It's also the reason why ICE agents are specifically going after some of the hardest working people in American society, specifically undocumented immigrant day laborers hanging out at Home Depots. They go there, they arrest them, they send them to places like Alligator Alcatraz to work in private for-profit prisons, and then that money that is being made off of their basically slave labor is being funneled back into the president's administration. So I think that we need to just go towards actually outlawing slavery and treating it as a crime against humanity, which the United States just voted against doing. Because if we are not going to take a stand against slavery, then we are the bad guys. And I want our country to be an actual beacon of hope that lives up to the values and principles we claim to care about.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I was reading an article yesterday, and I'm just going to tell you the headline because it tells a lot. A lot of the focus right now is on the Dilley Detention Center that's based in Texas. The headline, and it's from NBC News: Mama Five in immigration detention in Texas was taken to ER, sparking urgent calls for her release. A court filing says authorities at a detention center in Dilley, Texas, refused for weeks to get Hyman El Gamal a CT scan after she found an abnormal growth in her chest. There has been an astronomical amount of 911 calls to this specific detention center. This is also the detention center that Liam Ramos and his father were also sent to from Minnesota as well. That story shatters my heart every time I think about it, every time. And, that's been a big focus of advocating for these children, advocating for these families that are literally, trying to go to these courts to go through, they want them to go through this legal process. Well, yeah, obviously, right? But I can't even like begin to tell you how I feel right knowing that, and that's just for me, being somebody who just gives a damn, right? And somebody who has literally spent years advocating for children. I've been in advocacy spaces for the last 16 years. And, it's over half of my life. I'll be 30 years old this year, right? So I started whenever I was in high school. But I just genuinely do not understand why this shouldn't even be a headline in 2026. Shouldn't even be a headline. It shouldn't be a headline, period. But it shouldn't be a headline in 2026. This is not who we are. This is
I'd
not,
say the
this is,
reason why it's a headline is because the Democrats and the Republicans have been colluding because we really only have one party in this country, and that's the party of the ultra wealthy. Um, One of the worst things
blue
I think,
MAGA.
yeah, well, one of the worst things that happened was that in the 1990s, Bill Clinton made the Democrats a second party of business and left behind the working class. And then under Joe Biden, they created these crime bills that basically criminalized being black and brown and being poor. And that led to a huge rise in incarceration. And then the Democrats, because they've been trying to cozy up to corporate interests in the way that the Republicans have for a long time, have been trying to be more and more conservative. And they've given up on messaging about issues that actually matter. So I think one of the most frustrating things was during the 2024 presidential election, the Democrats were trying to be even more anti-immigrant than the Republicans. And they just gave up on talking about immigration in a humane way. And that I believe has directly led to the public acceptance of violence against minorities and immigrants. So I think we need to bring back moral clarity. And I used to say I'm going to bring ethics back to Congress, but I realized it was never there in the first place. So we're going to bring ethics to Congress because we should not be still doing these horrific crimes against humanity, like you said, in 2026.
And the thinking about that, so HR 29 was signed into law on January 29, 2025, which required the Department of Homeland Security to detain undocumented immigrants arrested for threat-related crimes such as shoplifting or burglary, named after the Georgia student Laken Riley. This is the Laken Riley Act, but this literally led to exactly where we are now. And this was under the Biden administration. I read this bill, and I personally would not have voted for it. Um, if I was to run for office, I would fight to overturn this because this is deeply alarming.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's all based on overly focusing on exceptions rather than the plurality of the actuality. So what
the
they love doing, sorry?
No, go ahead. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, basically like Laken Riley's murderer, right? Like he was held accountable. He went to friggin' prison, but they still are
Due
using that
process.
as justification to crack down on immigrants who overwhelmingly are far less likely to commit any kind of crime, let alone violent crimes, who are a net benefit to society. They do jobs that many Americans are not willing to do. They are continuously exploited. They pay into the system and get nothing back in return. And then every time the people who control the country destroy the economy, they get blamed and criminalized for it.
The right to due process, protected under the Fifth or the 14th Amendment, literally explicitly states that every person on American soil, regardless of, your immigration status, is entitled to the right to due process as affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And the attacks on due process and also birthright citizenship, if you're born on American land, or I guess I should say occupied land, um, you're a U.S. citizen because it does not matter literally if your parents are undocumented, etc. You're issued if you're born in an American hospital or on a base or anything like that. You are automatically a U.S. citizen. You receive your birth certificate and your social security number. The attacks on birthright citizenship is insane and shouldn't even be debating it in our courts. It's literally been ingrained in our society for decades. This is not something new. And but anyway, there was a new ICE detention, or I guess I shouldn't say like new ICE detention facility here in Kansas, in Leavenworth, Kansas, which is owned by Core Civic. Core Civic, the for-profit, obviously that owns a lot of private industrial complexes, but also owns a lot of the ICE detention centers. They specifically closed this one many years ago for the inhumane conditions that prisoners were facing. There was a lot of sexual abuse that went on in it, and there was a lot more that went into it. But the Leavenworth City Council voted all but one person voted to reopen it in a contract with DHS. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk to you about is the 287G contracts. Are you familiar with what a 287G contract is?
No, tell me about it.
287G contract is through DHS, which essentially local police departments can enact into this partnership and act as ICE agents, essentially, and act as
Gotcha. Like
DHS.
deputized as immigration enforcement, right?
Oh, Lord. Yeah. So, and you can actually go into Google and you can type in 287G and then your local area and see it pulls up because it's directly on the DHS website. There's thousands of police departments across the country that have agreed to act as ICE agents or, detain and then, you call ICE. And it's like this whole, like, this process. There's several in the Kansas City Metro. And then the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, we have like our own Bureau of Investigation, which is independent from the FBI. It functions kind of similarly, just on the state level. And they entered into the 287G contract, which obviously is statewide. Missouri Highway Patrol and a lot of Missouri departments have also enacted into it. But as far as like the 287G contracts go, it is obviously optional for these police departments to enact it. It's not required. Local law enforcement is not required to carry out federal operations. But thinking about this, what are your thoughts around these 287G contracts and
Yeah, I mean,
police acting as federal agents?
Yeah, I don't think they should be doing it. I mean,
Especially,
immigration, yeah,
especially whenever they receive local and state funding from the taxpayers. They should not be carrying out federal. If that's the case, then they should be funded by federal government. They should be funded by DHS. So that way we can have that money be rerouted and go into social programs here in the states and here in our local communities.
yeah. So here in California, we actually have, I believe it's in the state constitution, that there are basically sanctuary rules that limit cooperation and coordination between the federal immigration enforcement agencies and local law enforcement agencies. But we still have been seeing that even though they're not really helping, they're not like harming people by trying to help ICE agents. They're also not exactly helping people who are being brutalized or attacked by ICE agents either. So that's one part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that when you are treating local law enforcement as immigration enforcement, you make it a lot less likely for people to actually report crimes and call in emergencies because that means that, let's say you're an undocumented immigrant and you witness a horrific crime or someone is in severe dire straits, like there's a medical emergency. If you know that when you call the cops, they're going to kidnap and deport you, then you're just not going to call them. That's the entire reason why sanctuary laws exist, to make it so that people can actually engage in public safety services that are beneficial to the entire community without being penalized because of their immigration status. So I am against local law enforcement and state law enforcement agencies acting as federal immigration enforcement because it just once again undermines the trust that people have in law enforcement in general. Because it just means I know you're not going to help me. You're just going to hurt me if I call you. So I'm not going to call you and I can't trust you. That's one of the things I feel like is such a missed opportunity for local law enforcement agencies. Like if cops wanted to actually re-earn the trust of everyday people, they would be defending us against the tyranny of ICE. But instead, they're either doing nothing or they're helping. And that's part of the problem of our system. Like there's this overt deference of local and state law enforcement to the federal law enforcement agencies. But the problem is that all of the federal law enforcement agencies that actually did decent work have been completely gutted of anyone who actually upheld the Constitution or followed the law. And they've been replaced by loyalist cronies whose only qualification is that they're willing to say yes, sir, to Donald Trump, no matter what he says. So we need to completely reform our entire immigration system. And honestly, we also need to do the same thing for law enforcement in general. because we basically criminalize poverty and then we enforce poverty onto the citizenry. And it's just another way to continue making money off of suffering.
Yep, 100%. All right. I want to say thank you. Obviously, we don't do necessarily do like candidate endorsements per se, but I do recommend candidates. And obviously, this conversation has really been eye-opening, and I'm going to use a lot of what you've said to also talk to other candidates and kind of gauge like where they go. And I've been taking notes this entire time because I think it's important. You brought up a lot of key points, so now I'm kind of shifting how I'm thinking too and asking these questions. Now, my last question to you is, despite like how people can contribute to your campaign, et cetera, which we'll talk about here in a second, but a lot of candidates, they have incredible platforms, right? And they state that, and I don't get this energy from you. I feel like you're like genuine and like like genuinely care. But what I've seen far too many times is somebody states, "Oh, I won't back down. I won't back down. I won't back down." They get elected, all that goes to the wayside because they get in there and they have these lobbyists come to their offices and then they start shifting their opinions. They're like, oh, well, maybe actually, yeah, I can work with, XYZ and, work with Moms for Liberty and give them something. No, absolutely not. There's a reason Moms for Liberty is losing their grip on one. I mean, they didn't really have a grip anyway, but more like a grift, but they continue to lose their elections across the country because it's unpopular and it's indoctrinating. It literally is the actual true indoctrination. Now, what's your thought on that? Because, like I said, we see a lot of candidates. They're like, I'm not going to take PAC money. Yeah, I'm not going to bow down to the Israeli lobby. I'm not going to back down. But essentially, what's your thought on that? Are you going to keep your
Yeah.
promises to your platform, and what is your commitment on that
Oh,
right
absolutely. I mean, I also have neurodivergence. And one thing for me is that I always try to be sincere and I hate liars and bullies, right? But I'll even say like, the cadet honor code at West Point is a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, nor tolerate those who do. And I bring that with me everywhere that I go. I think that one of the things that is a problem is that our entire political system is designed by the ultra wealthy for the ultra wealthy, which means that it is very difficult for anyone who actually is aligned with the needs of everyday people to get into office because you just need money. Like money is our biggest struggle as well. Everyone who learns about our platform is like, I love your platform, I love what you stand for, I love the way that you're doing this campaign. But the problem is that they just don't know that we exist. And it's because the media companies are complicit in maintaining the status quo in a lot of cases. And the establishment is doing the same thing, where there's such a powerful incumbency effect here, where it's like as long as you can win two elections in a row, you can basically stay in Congress until you die of old age. And that's a huge problem. Now, for me, like all of my policies, everything that's on our platform is built on things that I genuinely believe. And it's also built on things that have been influenced by our interactions with the community. So our platform is both built on what does the empirical evidence say? What does the science say? But what do the experts who actually live these experiences say? Like literal people who are part of our community have contributed and written parts of the platform because that is what representation is supposed to be about. Now, for me, I believe that when you start taking money from people, it is impossible for you to ignore what they want you to do because you want them to keep giving you money. And I think that what we need to do is get money out of politics because that is the biggest corrupting factor that is going on in our political system. That's why even though I support term limits for every single government office, I think we need to get money out of politics at the same time because it is infinitely easier to replace a Bernie Sanders or AOC or what have you with someone unscrupulous who's willing to sell out their constituency for more money so they can stay in office, right? That's one aspect. The other thing is that you can say anything you want, but what really matters is what do you actually do? Like you talk the talk, but do you walk the walk? Now, our campaign, like we actually have praxis that's built off of the way that our platform is structured and the things that we are doing in our community. Like my entire campaign staff are basically people that I met while we were serving meals to our unhoused neighbors in downtown Sacramento, for example. They're people who we met because we took a firm moral stance on saying that genocide is bad, no matter who is doing it or who it's being done to. So for me, it's all about having moral clarity on the issues, actually speaking truth to power, and living the values that you espouse with your praxis. So you can tell the difference between someone who believes what they're saying and someone who doesn't by the way that they actually live their lives. And I surround myself with people who hold me accountable. All of my friends, all of my connections, my entire network now is just people who genuinely care about our communities and the people that we interact with. Now, if you are going to get elected on something, I believe that you have to follow through on that. And I believe that what the Democratic Party has been doing is so showing signs of weakness by messaging compromised positions. So for me, I obviously know that we have to do two things, right? We need to address people's immediate material concerns, and we need to fix the systemic problems that are continuously perpetuating those systemic concerns. So it's like we have to do the short-term game and the long-term game. And the only way that we're going to do that is by moving the Overton window, what is allowed in popular discourse, back towards progress and sanity and common sense based in human morality and just basic humanity. So I do think that that is a very real problem that we have. But the first biggest thing is that I will never take corporate or federal lobbyist or foreign interest money because once you start doing that, you become corrupt. I refuse to be corrupted by the system. I say that I can be influenced by empirical evidence and data and lived experience, but I will never be bought. And this is problematic, but I tell people like if I ever do a heel turn and turn into like a Tulsi Gabbard, then I want you to take me out. You know, like just take me out, please. It means that I had some kind of like terrible thing happen inside of my brain, or I've been replaced by a doppelganger because like I am sincere, and I feel like that's what we need more of in Congress. We need sincere people who are real people who actually care about other people. That's who we need representing us, not people who would just love to make an extra dollar for themselves and enrich themselves by stealing from the American public and doing war crimes in foreign countries.
Yep, 100%. All right, Chris. Thank you so much for I can't even like say anything else after that. I can't even because it's so incredibly true and it's so incredibly accurate. And it's just insane to me again that we're still having this conversation, but we'll
Yeah.
continue having the conversation until it sticks.
Yeah.
And
And one thing that you can tell for our campaign that's different is that we are not like pulling all of the power in centrally under the campaign, under me. Like we have built regional organizing committees throughout the district, and they have a ton of autonomy to show up for the campaign in the ways that make the most sense for where they actually live. And these people are the ones who are organizing themselves in their communities on behalf of the campaign. So that is not something that you see in just about any other congressional campaign because most of the time it's just about give me money, I'm going to pump out TV ads, and then you vote for me. But for us, we're actually trying to rebuild grassroots people power, like true grassroots people power, the kind that the Democratic Party gave up on when they became a second party of business. Like we're trying to go out and be that connective tissue between all these different issues and organizations that can easily be aligned under a single tent, but aren't because they're operating in their own silos. And one big thing that we're trying to do is convince people that politics does matter. Like, especially if you're like a nonprofit, for example, many nonprofits exist purely to address the material needs that are deprived from everyday people because of problems with our system. So we need to convince people that, first off, politics is what happens when you have more than three people in the room. Second off, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu. So we need people to realize that the only way that we're going to defeat authoritarian fascism is by coming together and recognizing our shared humanity and the fact that our values and our goals are generally speaking aligned across the board, as long as we don't let ourselves get distracted by culture war BS that's being pushed down on us from billionaires and the ruling class. So that is really the biggest thing that sets our campaign apart. We're actually focused on real people power, not just saying that we're grassroots because we don't take corporate money. Because grassroots doesn't just mean that. It either means you don't take corporate money or it means that you're actually trying to rebuild power at the grassroots level. And we're trying to do the latter, not the former.
Mic drop. That's that mic drop moment. It really is. But again, thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for running and bringing back the true populist and bringing back that true meaning of progressive. I feel like the word progressive gets thrown around like, yeah, I'm progressive. No, you're not. Because you're still
Yep.
taking APAC money, you're still taking this PAC money, you're still bought out by billionaires, you're still bought out by all of these special interest groups. And it leaves, don't even use that word. You're just a centrist. You're a part of the establishment. You're a part of, and you talk shit about people that are actually trying to, like you said, the Overton window and pull it to back to progressive. But again, thank you for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to continuing to watch your campaign. You have an open invite anytime you have anything you can amplify. Feel free to collaborate with us. We're here to amplify as much as possible. Um,
I really appreciate it.
and I look forward to continuing to talk with you and continue watching you grow as a candidate and hopefully as the next congressperson. I have a very strong suspicion that it's going to happen. I have a very strong suspicion. You became highly recommended that we talk to you. So by a lot of people, but I look forward to continue watching. And, again, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. And one thing I'll say is that this campaign's not about me. It's about the way that we want our future to be.
Mhm.
So, if you give us money or time or talent, you're investing in the platform and the vision of the future that we have. I do personally believe that many people could do just as good a job as me, or maybe even a better job. But I feel like we have a real chance to take back the power and make our system work for all of us instead of just, billionaires and monsters. So I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.